The rickety yellow bus groaned as it sped along the winding, dusty road. The late afternoon sun hung lazily in the sky, casting golden hues over the landscape. Tall palm trees lined the roadside, their fronds swaying gently in the warm breeze. The air smelled of red earth and distant wood smoke, a typical scent in rural Nigeria. Ada pressed her face against the cracked window, her 10-year-old eyes wide with excitement as the world zipped by in vibrant blurs of green trees and brown terrain. Her heart thumped in anticipation as they neared her uncle's village for the long-awaited family celebration. A radiant smile lit up her face, revealing dimples that her mother always teased would make her irresistible to suitors one day. Her father, a jovial man with a booming voice, hummed a highlife tune from the driver's seat. His hands gripped the steering wheel confidently, even as the bus bounced over potholes that dotted the road like mischievous landmines. Beside him sat Ada's mother, a graceful woman with a serene smile that could ease any worry. She tapped Ada playfully on the arm. "Keep your nose out of that window, Ada. You'll inhale all the dust in this village before we even arrive," her mother teased, her voice melodic. Ada giggled. "But I want to see the mango trees, Mama. I heard they're as big as Daddy's belly." Her father let out a hearty laugh. "Ah, Ada, you will not kill me with your mouth. My belly is healthy, not big. You and your mangoes," her mother sighed, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. "Don't forget, your cousins will be waiting to race you to the biggest one." The conversation bubbled with joy, the kind of happiness that wrapped around them like a protective cloak. Ada felt invincible in that moment, cradled by the love of her parents and the promise of a fun-filled weekend. As they ascended a gentle hill, the view opened up to reveal sprawling farmlands dotted with thatched roof houses. Ada's imagination soared. She pictured herself sprinting through the fields, her feet kicking up dust as she raced her cousins under the mango trees. The thought was so vivid that she could almost taste the sweet, sticky juice on her tongue. But joy can be fleeting. A sudden blare of a horn shattered the peace. The bus jolted violently as her father slammed the brakes. The tires screeched against the cracked asphalt. Time seemed to slow as Ada's mother let out a scream and clutched her daughter protectively. Through the windshield, Ada saw a massive truck barreling toward them, its driver struggling to regain control. The world tilted as the bus veered sharply to the left. Metal screeched against metal. Glass shattered into 1,000 glinting shards that caught the dying sunlight. Ada's head slammed against the window, pain exploding behind her eyes before darkness swallowed her whole. The world was silent when she opened her eyes again, save for the faint beeping of medical monitors. The sterile white walls of the hospital room loomed around her like a cold, indifferent prison. Her body ached, but it was the emptiness in her chest that hurt the most. Her parents were gone. The words were spoken by a nurse with soft eyes and a voice tinged with pity. "I'm so sorry, my dear," she said. "Your parents didn't survive the accident." Ada's mind struggled to process the words. How could the people who had laughed with her just hours ago now be gone? It didn't make sense. It felt like a bad dream, one she was desperate to wake up from. But no amount of pinching her arms or squeezing her eyes shut changed the cruel reality. In the days that followed, relatives came and went. They muttered words of condolence, their voices filled with obligation rather than genuine care. Ada sat silently through it all, her heart a hollow shell. Grief weighed heavily on her young shoulders, dragging her deeper into a pit of despair. As time passed, the relatives' visits became less frequent. One by one, they offered their excuses. They had their own families to care for, their own burdens to bear. Ada's presence became a problem no one wanted to solve. Just when it seemed like she would be left completely alone, Mr. Mark appeared. He was a tall, charismatic Nigerian man in his early 40s, with a voice that commanded attention and a smile that seemed warm enough to melt ice. He had always been a family friend, present at gatherings with jokes and stories that made everyone laugh. Now he stood by Ada's hospital bed, his eyes filled with sympathy. "Ada," he said gently, "I'm so sorry about your parents. They were good people." Ada nodded numbly, unable to find her voice. I know things are hard right now, he continued, but you don't have to go through this alone. You'll come home with me. I'll take care of you. Desperate and with nowhere else to turn, Ada clung to that promise. Little did she know that her nightmare was only beginning. The heavy iron gate creaked as Mr. Mark pushed it open. Welcome home, Ada, he said with a wide smile, his voice echoing off the walls of the compound. Ada clutched her small suitcase, her heart heavy as she took in the modest bungalow before her. The cream-colored walls had patches where the paint had begun to peel, and the tiled roof was streaked with brown from years of weather exposure. It was nothing like the cheerful home she had shared with her parents, but it was better than the bleak hospital room that had become her prison of grief. Come inside, Mr. Mark urged, leading her through the front door. The interior smelled faintly of polished wood and freshly brewed coffee. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the tiled floor. The living room was simple, yet tidy, with a brown leather couch, a glass coffee table, and framed photos on the walls. Ada noticed one picture of Mark standing proudly in a suit, shaking hands with an important-looking man. For a moment, the warmth of the room made Ada believe she could start anew here. Mark guided her to a small bedroom at the end of the hallway. "This will be your room," he announced, opening the door. Ada stepped inside cautiously. The room was sparse but clean. A narrow bed with crisp white sheets sat against the wall, and a wooden wardrobe stood in the corner. A small desk with a chair completed the setup. "It's simple, but it's all yours," Mark said kindly. "Thank you, Uncle Mark," Ada whispered, her voice barely audible. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're part of my family now, Ada. We'll take care of each other, all right?" Ada nodded, though a pang of doubt lingered in her chest. The first few weeks in Mr. Mark's house were peaceful. He played the role of a doting guardian with effortless charm. He made sure Ada went to school, packed her lunch, and even helped her with homework in the evenings. On weekends, he would cook jollof rice and chicken, filling the house with the comforting aroma of spices. Despite the ache of her parents' absence, Ada began to feel a sense of stability. One Saturday afternoon, Mark handed her a new dress wrapped in a shiny plastic bag. "Go on, try it," he urged. Ada's eyes lit up as she pulled out the dress, a beautiful yellow gown with lace trimmings. "It's so pretty," she exclaimed. "You're my princess now," Mark said, beaming. "I want you to have the best." Ada's heart warmed at his words. For a fleeting moment, she thought she had found a father figure who would protect and love her. But soon, cracks began to form in the perfect picture. At first, it was the lingering glances. Mark's eyes would rest on Ada a bit too long, making her feel exposed and uneasy. Then came the possessive compliments. "You're growing into a beautiful young lady," he would say, his tone unsettling. Ada didn't understand why his words made her skin crawl, but she brushed it off. Maybe she was just being overly sensitive. One evening, as they sat watching a Nollywood movie in the living room, Mark's arm draped casually over the back of the couch. Ada was engrossed in the film when she felt his hand brush against her shoulder. She stiffened, but he didn't seem to notice. "You remind me of your mother," he murmured. Ada's heart ached at the mention of her mother, but there was something off about the way Mark said it. She couldn't quite place it, but unease crept into her chest. As time went on, the atmosphere in the house grew tense. Mark's touches became more frequent, innocuous enough to dismiss, but persistent enough to make Ada wary. One afternoon, Ada stood by the kitchen sink, washing plates after lunch. Mark entered the kitchen and stood behind her. His presence loomed over her, making her hands tremble as she rinsed a plate. "You've been doing a great job helping around the house," he said, his voice low. "Thank you, Uncle Mark," Ada replied, keeping her gaze fixed on the soapy water. "You know you're special to me, right?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ada forced a smile, unsure of how to respond. "Yes, Uncle Mark," she whispered. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Ada's thoughts raced. The once warm house now felt cold and stifling. Shadows danced on the walls, and every creak of the wooden floor made her flinch. Grief gnawed at her heart, but a new fear had taken root. She couldn't understand it fully, but she knew one thing: something was wrong. Ada pulled the blanket tighter around herself, willing sleep to come. But the darkness held no comfort, only the faint whisper of danger lurking in the shadows. The night was stiflingly hot, with no breeze to ease the oppressive warmth. The power had gone out earlier, plunging the house into darkness. Ada lay on her bed, sweat trickling down her forehead as she tossed and turned beneath the thin bedsheet. The faint glow of moonlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick, with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets outside. Ada's thoughts raced as she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying fragments of memories, her parents' laughter, the smell of her mother's favorite perfume, the sound of her father's hearty chuckle. A sudden creak echoed through the hallway. Ada froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to hear, hoping it was just the woods settling. But then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, heading toward her room. Her breath quickened as fear gripped her. She clutched the bedsheet tightly, willing herself to remain calm. The door handle turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open. "Ada?" Mark's voice was low, almost a whisper. She sat up, her pulse racing. "Uncle Mark?" He stepped into the room, the faint moonlight illuminating his face. He wore a loose t-shirt and shorts, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice strained. "It's too hot tonight." Ada forced a nervous smile. "Yes, it's really hot." Mark moved closer, his presence suffocating. "I thought we could talk for a bit," he said, sitting on the edge of her bed. Ada's instincts screamed at her to run, but her body felt paralyzed. She tried to keep her voice steady. "What do you want to talk about?" He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You're such a beautiful girl, Ada. Do you know that?" Her stomach twisted in knots. "Thank you, Uncle Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but there was no one to hear her, no one to save her. Mark's hand lingered on her shoulder, his grip tightening. Ada's heart raced, terror coursing through her veins. "Uncle Mark, please," she began, her voice trembling. But he didn't stop. What followed was a nightmare Ada could never have imagined. Her pleas and cries were drowned out by Mark's heavy breathing. She fought with all her strength, but he was too strong. The world blurred into a haze of pain and despair. When it was over, Ada lay curled up on the bed, her body shaking with sobs. The bedsheet was twisted and damp with sweat. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily. "You can't tell anyone about this," he said, his voice cold and devoid of remorse. "No one will believe you. They'll think you're lying." Ada's tears soaked the pillow. She felt broken, shattered beyond repair. Her childhood had been stolen in a single, brutal moment. Mark stood up and adjusted his shirt. "Good night, Ada," he said, as though nothing had happened. He walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. Ada lay motionless, her body numb. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her, suffocating her. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into thin air. But there was no escape from the nightmare that had become her reality. The next morning, Ada sat at the breakfast table, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Mark acted as though nothing had happened, cheerfully serving her toast and eggs. "Eat up, Ada. You need your strength for school," he said with a smile. She stared at the plate, her appetite gone. The mere sight of food made her stomach churn. I'm not hungry," she mumbled. Mark's smile faltered. "Come on, you need to eat. You don't want to get sick, do you?" Ada forced herself to take a bite, the bread tasting like ash in her mouth. Mark's presence loomed over her, a constant reminder of the previous night's horror. At school, Ada sat in class, her mind a million miles away. The teacher's voice was a distant hum, drowned out by the storm of emotions raging within her. Her classmates laughed and chatted, oblivious to the turmoil consuming her. Mrs. Okafor, her kind-hearted teacher, noticed Ada's silence. After class, she gently pulled her aside. "Ada, is everything all right?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Ada forced a smile. Yes, Ma. Are you sure? You seem distracted today. I'm fine, Ma, Ada insisted, her voice cracking. Mrs. Okafor studied her for a moment before nodding. If you ever need to talk, I'm here for you. Ada's heart ached with the weight of unspoken words, but fear kept her silent. Back at Mark's house, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Ada tiptoed around him, her nerves frayed. She dreaded the nights, knowing the darkness would bring new horrors. Each night, she prayed for a miracle, for someone to rescue her from the nightmare. But no one came. Mark's words echoed in her mind. No one will believe you. The betrayal cut deep, leaving scars that would never fully heal. Ada's world had become a twisted version of what it once was. Her only solace was the faint hope that one day she would find a way to escape and reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. The days blurred into a haze of dread and anguish for Ada. Each morning, she woke up with a hollow ache in her chest, knowing that she had to face Mark again. Her once cheerful demeanor had withered into silence, her eyes losing their spark. She went about her chores like a ghost, hoping that staying quiet would somehow protect her. But Mark's actions grew more frequent and brazen. What began as occasional violations became routine, his twisted duality an affectionate guardian by day and a predator by night nod at Ada's spirit. During the day, he would smile warmly, helping her with homework and cooking meals. Neighbors admired his apparent devotion to the orphaned girl. "You're lucky to have such a caring guardian," one of the neighbors remarked as Ada stood outside fetching water. Ada forced a smile, but inside, shame churned like a storm. Her heart raced every time someone spoke about Mark in a positive light. She felt as though she were trapped in a twisted play, where everyone saw Mark as the hero while she lived the dark truth. At school, Ada's teachers noticed her declining performance. Her once excellent grades plummeted, and she became withdrawn. She rarely spoke in class and avoided eye contact with her classmates. The lively 10-year-old who had once loved storytelling now barely uttered a word. One afternoon during lunch break, her best friend, Chisholm, tried to cheer her up. "Ada, do you want to play hopscotch?" Chisholm asked, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Ada shook her head. "No, I'm tired." "You're always tired these days," Chisholm said, frowning. "Are you okay?" Ada's throat tightened. She wanted to tell Chisholm everything, to scream, to cry, to beg for help, but fear clamped her mouth shut. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That night, the cycle repeated itself. Ada lay on her bed, her body rigid with fear. The familiar creak of Mark's footsteps echoed through the hallway. Her heart pounded so loudly that she was certain he could hear it. The door opened, and Mark entered, his face shadowed in the dim light. Ada squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to disappear. "Don't pretend you're asleep," Mark said, his voice cold. Ada's body trembled as she sat up. "Please, Uncle Mark," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He silenced her with a glare. "Do as I say, or you'll regret it." The weight of his words crushed her. Ada stopped fighting. She learned that resistance only made things worse. Each violation stripped away a piece of her soul, leaving her hollow and numb. The abuse took its toll on her physical health. She grew frail, her once plump cheeks now sunken. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her school uniform hung loosely on her thinning frame. One morning, during assembly, Ada felt dizzy. The words of the principal blurred into a distant hum. Her knees wobbled, and before she knew it, the world tilted, and darkness engulfed her. Gasps echoed around her as she collapsed to the ground. Teachers rushed to her side, and she was carried to the school clinic. When Ada regained consciousness, the school nurse was frowning at her. "Have you been eating properly, Ada?" the nurse asked. Ada nodded weakly. "Yes, Ma." The nurse didn't look convinced. "You need to take better care of yourself, young lady. You're too young to be this weak." Ada's lips quivered, but she remained silent. The whispers among her classmates grew louder after the incident. Rumors spread like wildfire, with some students speculating that Ada was seriously ill. Others wondered if she was simply seeking attention. Back home, Mark's temper flared when he heard about the incident. Do you want people to start asking questions? He demanded, his face contorted with rage. I'm sorry, Ada whispered, tears streaming down her face. Sorry isn't good enough, he snapped. You need to be careful. No one can know what goes on in this house. Ada nodded, fear gripping her throat. The weight of Mark's threats and her own shame silenced her. She carried the burden alone, too afraid to confide in anyone. Her teacher, Mrs. Okafor, continued to express concern, but Ada's responses remained guarded. Ada, I'm here for you, Mrs. Okafor said one afternoon after class. You can talk to me about anything. Ada forced a smile. Thank you, Ma. But she couldn't bring herself to speak the truth. The abuse continued, day after day, night after night. Ada's sense of self-worth eroded, and she began to believe Mark's cruel words that she was worthless and that no one would ever believe her. Her nights were filled with nightmares, and her days were a blur of numbness. She longed for her parents, for their love and protection, but they were gone, and she was alone in a world that seemed cold and unkind. Ada clung to the faint hope that one day she would escape the darkness that had engulfed her life. Until then, she endured, surviving one agonizing day at a time. The afternoon sun blazed through the window, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Ada sat quietly on the worn-out, her hands resting on her lap. Her body had grown frail, but her belly now bore a swelling she couldn't hide. Fear wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. At first, she had dismissed the signs missing her monthly cycle, sudden bouts of nausea, and an overwhelming fatigue that left her breathless. But now, the truth was undeniable. Ada was carrying Mark's child. She wanted to scream, to cry out for justice, but guilt and shame paralyzed her. Her thoughts spiraled into darkness. Who would believe her? She was just a young girl with no one to protect her. Mark's presence loomed over the house like a dark cloud. His eyes, once filled with deceitful kindness, now burned with anger and paranoia. He had noticed the change in Ada, and tension crackled in the air whenever they crossed paths. One evening, after dinner, Mark called her into the living room. His voice was colder than the Harmattan breeze. Ada, he said sternly, sit down. Her heart raced as she obeyed, her trembling hands resting on her knees. What's going on with you? He demanded, his eyes narrowing. You think I haven't noticed? Ada's throat tightened. She couldn't find the words to explain the nightmare she was living. I'm not feeling well, she stammered. Mark's face twisted in fury. Don't lie to me, he shouted, slamming his hand on the coffee table. Ada flinched, tears welling up in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean for this to happen. You didn't mean for this to happen? He spat. Do you know what you've done? Ada's sobs racked her body. But you... Mark's glare silenced her. Don't you dare try to blame me, he roared. This is your fault. You're trying to ruin my life. His words cut through her like a knife. The man who had taken her in, who had once promised to protect her, now stood before her as a monster devoid of any compassion. Mark paced the room, his fury mounting. Do you have any idea what people will say if they find out? He seethed. My reputation will be destroyed. Ada felt as though the ground had crumbled beneath her feet. Her entire existence was a burden to Mark, and he made sure she knew it. You can't stay here anymore, he declared, his voice icy. Her eyes widened in disbelief. But where will I go? I don't care, he snapped. You're not my problem anymore. Mark's words shattered the last remnants of Ada's fragile world. She was being cast out like garbage, discarded by the very person who had claimed to care for her. As Mark stormed out of the room, Ada sat frozen in shock. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to process the betrayal. The weight of the unborn child within her pressed heavily on her heart. The next morning, Mark threw her belongings into a tattered bag and shoved it into her arms. Leave, he ordered, his voice devoid of any emotion. Ada stood at the doorstep, her legs trembling. The neighborhood was bustling with activity women selling vegetables, children playing in the street, and men returning from work. But none of them seemed to notice the young girl with tear-streaked cheeks and a swollen belly being cast out of her home. Her eyes darted around, hoping for a kind face, someone who would intervene. But no one did. The weight of their indifference crushed her spirit. "Go now," Mark barked, shoving her forward. Ada stumbled onto the street, clutching her bag tightly. The world blurred around her as tears clouded her vision. She had no destination, no plan, and no hope. As she walked aimlessly through the streets of Lagos, the city pulsed with life around her. Vendors shouted their wares, and the scent of roasted corn wafted through the air. But Ada felt like an outsider, invisible and unwanted. Her feet ached, and her body screamed for rest, but she kept moving. Nightfall crept in, and the once vibrant city grew shadowy and foreboding. Fear gnawed at her. Where would she sleep? What would she eat? Her thoughts spiraled into despair. She thought of her parents, their laughter, their warmth, and the love that had once enveloped her. If only they were still alive. As she wandered through a dimly lit street, exhaustion overcame her. She sank to the ground, her body trembling. Sobs racked her fragile frame as she clutched her belly. "Why me?" she whispered into the darkness. The world offered no answers. But amidst the darkness, a flicker of resolve ignited within her. Ada knew she couldn't give up. She had a child to protect, a life that depended on her strength. Wiping her tears, she rose to her feet. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with pain and hardship, but she would keep moving. She had to survive. To be continued. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification button.